Welcome, everyone. I'm Mary Gallagher. I'm the Director of the International Institute at the University of Michigan. Welcome to this II Roundtable, the global implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The roundtable will bring together experts in international politics, Central Asia, US-China relations, and Europe to discuss how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has upended the global economy and political order far beyond the boundaries of the conflict itself. We will discuss the invasion's impact on US-China relations, global energy markets, European politics, and much, much more. This event is co-sponsored by the Center for Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies, the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and the Weiser Diplomacy Center at the Ford School, all at the University of Michigan. To see more resources on Michigan's coverage of the war in Ukraine, please visit the dedicated webpage on WCEE's website, which is now being added to the Zoom chat. And just as a reminder, if you're having any technical problems with Zoom, please send your problem directly through the Q&A and somebody will help you through the problems. I'm going to introduce our speakers one after another, and then we'll begin the roundtable. We'll leave about 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. Our first speaker is Daniel Russel, the Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. A career member of the Senior Foreign Service at the US State Department, he served until March 2017 as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary on July 12, 2013, Mr. Russel served at the White House as Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for Asian Affairs. During his tenure there, he helped formulate President Obama's strategic rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region. During his 33-year diplomatic career, Mr. Russel is the recipient of numerous awards, most recently the 2017 Presidential Rank Award. And we thank him for coming today. The next speaker is Pauline Jones, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Digital Islamic Studies curriculum. Previously, she served as Director of U of M's Islamic Studies program and also the International Institute. Her past work has contributed broadly to the study of institutional origin, change, and impact, with an empirical focus on the former Soviet Union, particularly the 5 Central Asian states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Currently, she is engaged in 2 major research projects. One explores the influence of religion on political attitudes and behavior in Muslim-majority states, with an emphasis on the relationship between religious regulation, religiosity, and political mobilization. Her other project focuses on identifying the factors that affect the extent to which people comply with social distancing policies to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Our third speaker, Maria Popova, is Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. She is also the scientific co-director of the Jean Monnet Centre Montréal. She has lived and conducted research across Eastern Europe and Eurasia in its various regime incarnations, from growing up in Bulgaria before 1989, through interviewing judges and lawyers in Russian and Ukraine for dissertation research in the 2000s, to her current attempt to disentangle real from fake anti-corruption efforts in Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine. Her work explores the intersection of politics and law in the post-communist region, specifically the rule of law, judicial reform, political corruption, populist parties, and legal repression of dissent. Her book, Politicized Justice in Emerging Democracies, won the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Prize for Best Book in the fields of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture. Our last speaker, John Ciorciari, is an associate professor of public policy and director of the Ford School's International Policy Center and the Weiser Diplomacy Center. His research focuses on international law and politics in the Global South. He is the author of Sovereignty, Sharing, in Fragile States, published in 2021 by Stanford, and co-editor with Kyotaro Tsutsui of The Courteous Power, Japan and Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific Era. Ciorciari has been an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, an Asia Society Fellow, a postdoc fellow at Stanford, and a policy official in the US Treasury Department's Office of International Affairs. Without further ado, I will move to the roundtable with our first speaker, Danny Russel. Thank you.
I'd like to talk about China and about Asia a little more broadly. And my first point is that for China, this is not a Ukraine crisis. It's a Russia crisis. And it's filled with contradictions for Beijing. Because Russia is an important strategic partner for China. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, sees the US as the paramount security challenge. So Russia's role is valuable in challenging the West and helping to accelerate its decline, particularly the decline in American influence and American credibility. At the same time, the US and the rest of Western Europe are absolutely vital to China's economic development, as a source of capital or innovation, trade, and so on, whereas the Russian economy is much too small, too weak to help China really modernize. So Beijing doesn't want to get dragged deeper into confrontation with the West and pay a price. But no sooner had Xi Jinping sat down with Vladimir Putin on February the 4th at the Olympic opening and deepened China's stake in that relationship with this no limits partnership declaration, then Putin turned around and put himself at odds with the West over something that does not benefit China in any way. So Beijing is, caught off guard, particularly by Putin moving so precipitously to launch a full-on invasion, and caught off guard by the Russian military's incompetence. And now it's kind of scorched earth attacks on civilians, as well as caught off guard by the strength of both the Ukrainian resistance on the ground and also the solidarity of the West. So Beijing sees a number of risks. There's damage to Russia, its strategic partner. There are risks to the Chinese economy, either through the risk of secondary sanctions, if they're seen as violating US regulations, or damage to the global economy more broadly. And it comes at a time when Xi Jinping really just can't afford that. After all, economic trouble is political trouble in China in the run-up to the upcoming 20th Party Congress. And on top of that, he's pretty busy fending off potential disaster from the Omicron variant to Putin. And then, of course, there's the risk of damage to China's reputation. So what we've seen is a China that's awkwardly straddling the contradiction between its support for Putin and its international image as a defender of state sovereignty. And in typical Leninist fashion, the party is relying on their fog machine of cliches about restraint and peaceful resolution and so on, not now including at least in the English language international press, definitely not at home, the flirtation with a possible role as quote unquote mediator. The other day, US intelligence leaked an assessment that the Russians may be looking for military supplies from China, made that claim public, forcing China into even more contortions. And it really just highlights Beijing doesn't want to be seen as enabling Putin's brutal campaign or acceding to Washington's demand that Beijing try to stop Putin. Now, moving beyond just Beijing, I think the Asian views of the Ukraine crisis can maybe be divided into sort of three groups of countries. You have countries like Japan, Korea, Australia, Singapore, who are aligned solidly with the West and clearly denouncing the Russian invasion. Then you've got a second group, basically India and Vietnam, countries that rely heavily on Russian weapons in their border disputes with China. And unsurprisingly, they're being rather circumspect about overt condemnation of Moscow. And in most of Southeast Asia, you actually see a certain amount of sympathy for the NATO made him do it alibi for Putin. In other words, that it's somehow the West's fault for boxing him into a corner. And I think that's less because there's much affinity for Russia in Southeast Asia, and more because there's still a lot of suspicion towards the United States, some historical rooted in anti-colonialism, and non-alignment, but particularly after 15 years of the global war on terror and 4 years of Donald Trump. But more broadly, I'd say that all Asian countries are watching the Ukraine crisis through the lens of China. So, violating the territorial integrity of a sovereign state is probably the strongest taboo of the post-World War II UN-based system. And it's not just that Vladimir Putin blew through that taboo on February 21st, it's that Xi Jinping went along for the ride. And so what leaders in Asia saw was Putin making a transition from gray zone tactics, that's threats and coercion, influence operations, deniable assassinations, to a brazen head-on military assault. No gray anymore, just black and white. So the thought bubble over the heads of Asian leaders is, will Beijing now also start shifting from gray to black? Will it go from threats to use force in the South China Sea or the Senkakus or the line of actual control on the Indian border or Taiwan? Now, Taiwan is a much longer story, and we may get to it in Q&A. I'd only point out that the Chinese propaganda in Taiwan about Ukraine is very straightforward. It says, hey, the Americans couldn't stop Putin from moving into Ukraine. American sanctions aren't going to force him to withdraw. The US is basically washed up, paper tiger. It wouldn't risk a military confrontation with Russia. So what makes you think it's going to risk one with China? So, get over your fantasy about America riding to the rescue of Taiwan. Resistance is futile. We're here, America isn't. And you can do this the easy way or you can do this the hard way. What's it going to be? So all in all, my read on the Chinese leadership, and this is your area of expertise, is that they may be appalled by the inefficiency of the Russian military, but they are convinced that when the dust finally settles, the United States is going to be diminished in the eyes of the world because it couldn't stop or roll back the invasion. Secondly, that Washington is going to be consumed by European security issues, and the promised post-Afghanistan refocus on the Indo-Pacific, pushing back against China, well, that's on the back burner. Third, that Washington is going to seek China's help in using its influence with Putin, kind of like Washington has long tried to get the Chinese to help with North Korea, and with no success. So from my point of view, the game plan in Beijing is to help Putin weather international sanctions and criticism, do it carefully enough to dodge significant US sanctions against China, talk a good game about ceasefire and mediation while the Russian campaign continues, keep the focus on NATO expansion, deflecting criticism from China, concentrate on domestic priorities like the coronation of Xi Jinping, like the Omicron variant, and exploit the West's preoccupation with Eastern Europe as long as you can. So in the short term, the impact of the Ukraine crisis on US-China relations is going to hinge on whether the US decides to apply financial sanctions directly against Chinese entities in a significant way, since that opens the door to tit-for-tat retaliation, to an expansion of the US-China headbutting that's been underway. Hopefully, Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi's meeting in Rome yesterday has reduce that risk somewhat. But in the longer term, I worry that Washington and Beijing will find that their negative perceptions of the other have been validated, have been strengthened. Washington, that China is aligned with Russia in a threatening axis of authoritarianism, and Beijing, that the US is both implacably hostile and fading has-been power. So I'll end there only by saying I sincerely hope that I'm wrong.
Thanks, Danny, so much. Let's go to Pauline.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you so much to everyone at the International Institute for organizing this event. I am going to focus my remarks on the regional and global economic effects of both Russia's war against Ukraine and the international sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in response. Specifically, I want to look at the economic impact on Central Asia and the short, medium, and long-term impact on global energy markets. If there's a sort of one sentence takeaway from my remarks, they would be that the costs of doing business with Russia have just become way too high, both regionally and globally. Let's start first with Central Asia. Central Asia's economies are highly exposed to Russia because of the high levels of economic integration. Some countries in the regions are more closely tied and thus more highly exposed, but they're all feeling the impact of the war and sanctions. The impact has been immediate, and it's primarily occurred through four key mechanisms. The first is the collapse of the ruble. The ruble's declined by over 50%, and this has had an immediate negative impact on local currencies, which rise and fall with the ruble. In Kazakhstan, for example, the local currency, the tenge, has lost 20% of its value since the war began, and this is despite the fact that Kazakhstan is really the only country in the region that has both substantial foreign reserves to prop up its currency and a very competent central bank. The central bank spent almost $100 million already to try to preserve the currency's value to no avail. The largest local impact of the ruble's decline, though, is on wages of migrant laborers. And this affects mostly Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. In Tajikistan, for example, the somoni, the local currency, has lost 35% of its value since the war began. And this is really important because remittances, which account for about 1/3 of that country's economy, are sent home as rubles and received in Tajikistan as somoni. So it's really decreasing the value of these wages. The second mechanism is the collapse in trade. So Russia is one of the top 3 trading partners for every country in the region. The region's heavily reliant on both imports from Russia and exports to Russia, although it's mostly reliant on imports from Russia. And one of the most crucial imports is grain. Just a few days ago, Russia announced that it will extend its ban on the export of grain, as well as sugar and other foodstuffs, to members of the Eurasian Economic Union in order to protect its own food security. And it's going to extend this ban until the end of August, which has understandably sparked fear of food shortages throughout the region. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are the most affected, both because they are members of the Eurasian Economic Union and because they are the largest importers of Russian grain. Kazakhstan is the 3rd largest importer of Russian grain in the world. It's just behind Turkey and Egypt. And in fact, it's increased its grain purchase recently by over 75% last year, for example, after it had a drought that greatly affected its own grain harvest. Kyrgyzstan relies on both Kazakhstan and Russia for 90% of its grain imports. One of the crucial exports the region relies on is crude oil. And this, of course, concerns primarily Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's been hit the hardest by the pressures on or the obstacles to its ability to export its crude oil. Crude oil is its biggest export. It's over 57% of its total exports, and it makes up about 40% of the state budget. And the bulk of Kazakhstan's crude oil shipments, about 2/3, currently transit through southern Russia via the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, or the CPC. Even before the US oil embargo, buyers were refusing to purchase oil shipped through the CPC for 2 reasons. One, it runs through Russia, so they were worried about this sort of cost of war and instability. But two, because it also carries Russian oil, and there was this real concern that if Kazakhstan's oil mixes with Russian oil, they could be in violation of sanctions, and they didn't want to do that. There's also, of course, just the sort of general reputational effect of engaging in business with Russia while it's itself engaged in this war in Ukraine. The third mechanism is through investment. Russia is one of the largest sources of FDI in Central Asia, second only to China. And as its economy comes to a standstill, so do these really crucial investment dollars in Central Asia. The fourth and final mechanism I'll talk about with regard to how the decline in Russia's economy affects Central Asia's economy is just the overall decline in economic activity that's happening in Russia. This has a direct impact as well on remittances from migrant laborers, which, as I said before, crucial source of income for these countries. Whereas the devaluation of the ruble, of course, affects the value of wages, the decline in economic activity affects the overall volume of wages. Most migrants are employed in the retail and construction industries or sectors, and there are just fewer jobs in these sectors while the economy's in decline. The economic significance, like I said, really can't be overstated. Remittances provide a financial lifeline to the Central Asian countries, particularly Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where they represent more than a quarter of their GDP. And so the economic impact will be enormous. Already, there are predictions that remittances in Central Asia will decline by more than a quarter in 2022. Meanwhile, the Central Asian governments are also very likely to face some popular backlash. These will come in two main forms. The first is really from the war itself. While the governments of the region have tried to remain more or less neutral in the war, there are lots of signs of popular support for Ukraine's conflict. It's pretty unambiguous, and it's most visible in Kazakhstan. I can talk more if there's interest in the Q&A, but there are some very interesting and visible signs of popular support for Ukraine and wanting their governments to be less neutral. The second sort of source of popular backlash, of course, is going to come from the economic consequences of the war. The governments in the region are going to face enormous pressure from the inflation and the employment, and social unrest is very likely to follow. We've already seen that just a few months ago in Kazakhstan with rising fuel prices, leading to a large mass protest across the country. My own research that tracks protests in Central Asia since 1991 shows that the majority of protests are driven by economic grievances, and these have increased since 2010. Turning really quickly to energy markets, I want to talk about the short term, and I'll collapse sort of the medium and longer term implications here. The short term effects we're already seeing. They're higher prices, higher oil prices, right? Oil is already at $130 a barrel. It's expected to hit 185 by the end of the year. Some analysts tell us that it could reach as high as 300, including the foreign minister of Russia tells us that it could reach as high as $300 a barrel. And just for reference, crude oil was selling at $90 a barrel just 1 month ago. So it's been quite a high spike in prices. The reason for this is pretty easy. It's all about supply. Russia is the second largest exporter of crude oil, and it's a concentration in supply at a time when demand was already rising, and so the price increases as a result. The economic impact, of course, is global inflation, slowed economic growth, and these energy prices. It's important to note were already rising well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, due to the tight supply and the pent-up demand from consumers as economies were beginning to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So, to say the least, it's exacerbated the situation. Another short-term effect is a shortage. So there's still a supply issue, or lack of supply issue, a lower supply than demand issue. And so we, the United States and other countries in the West, are going to have to dip into strategic reserves and try to find ways to ramp up production, in part by looking to other countries. The Biden administration is committed to releasing more than 90 million barrels from our strategic petroleum reserve this fiscal year. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, has agreed to coordinate a release of 60 million barrels of oil reserves, with about half coming from the United States. Europe, of course, is going to be hardest hit. About 40% of its energy comes from Russia. It's the single largest collective buyer of Russian oil. But Europe has about 32% of its natural gas supplies, and the OECD states also have a strategic petroleum reserve. which should hold about 90 days minimum supply of total oil imports for each country. This is about 2 months of reserve. And 2 months, arguably, is enough time for the US and Canada to ramp up their production, as well as possibly Norway, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Although the Saudi Arabia and UAE are a little more complicated. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Turning to the medium and longer term implications, there's an acute need to find alternative suppliers of oil and gas. So 2 months is not a long time. The most viable sources in terms of their ability to produce are Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Iran, and Venezuela. None of these, frankly, are good options. They're either economically fraught, they're politically fraught, or both. Saudi Arabia and the UAE can easily make up the shortfall if they agree to produce an additional 2.5 million barrels a day. They have the capacity, but so far negotiations have not been fruitful, in part because Saudi Arabia and UAE have a pre-existing agreement with Russia that they are maintaining, and because the United States and Saudi Arabia's relationship has become tense, to say the least, in the last few years. The next best options are Venezuela and Iran. From a crude market perspective, Venezuela is the best choice after Saudi Arabia and UAE because United Arab Emirates, because it would offer a close replacement to the heavier crudes that are typically delivered by Russian imports. But it can only produce, Venezuela is really only capable of producing about 600,000 additional barrels a day, and it would need a lot of Western assistance and investment to do this. Because of the deterioration in its oil sector under Chavez. Iran is probably the next best source. It can provide an additional 1.3 million barrels a day, but then that would happen only if trade sanctions are lifted, and this is complicated by the fact that Russia has to agree to lifting those trade sanctions. The second sort of medium to longer term implication is that this is showing an acute need for us to reduce our energy dependence. It's time for Europe to diversify away from Russian hydrocarbon resources. And I think the trend in this direction has started. If there's any silver lining, I hate to say that, it's that Europe is very well aware of this need. On the same day that the US announced its decision to ban oil, the UK matched it with its own sort of phase out of Russian imports by the end of 22. Of course, the UK doesn't import much, so it doesn't seem like that's very meaningful or impactful. But meanwhile, the EU also unveiled a plan to cut Russian gas exports by 2/3 within a year. And reducing dependence on fossil fuels is a realistic objective. In 2020, renewables generated about 38% of the EU's electricity. So there is some viability to it. It's of course going to require significant investment. That investment has to take place as soon as possible. It's going to take significant resources to expand deployment of clean power technologies, build out a grid and grid connections, and invest in storage capacity. I think it's also important to note that these changes are not limited to Europe or simply diversification. We really need to commit to investing in developing clean energy and ending our dependence on fossil fuels. It's not just about Russia, of course. It's about the problems with alternative suppliers that I mentioned. And finally, lastly, and I'll close here, just as we're going to be searching and need to search for alternative suppliers, Russia's searching for alternative buyers. And in the short term, of course, it'll have to sell at a discount, which will negatively affect the Russian economy. But in the longer term, it could mean a fundamental reshaping of the international oil market along geopolitical lines. Russian oil and gas could end up being permanently shifted to China, India, and other countries in Asia. And this, of course, has some serious political implications, especially if either the West fails to find viable alternative suppliers, or if the West fails to end its energy dependence on Russia and fossil fuels.
Great, thank you so much. Let's go to Maria.
Hi, thanks for having me. I've already learned some really interesting things from the other speakers. So what I want to talk about today is two questions. The first one is, as you may already know, Ukraine has applied for EU membership. And one of the issues this is the main question that the EU is dealing with, how to respond to that. Should it put Ukraine on some sort of accelerated path? And what are the arguments for or against that? And then the second question I want to deal with is the question of whether the war really is going to fundamentally change the EU-Russia relationship. Of course, it depends on how the war ends, but I'll talk a bit about that too. So on the first question, what I want to argue here is that Ukraine is actually more ready for EU membership than we realized, even before this war started. And also the war kind of counterintuitively has actually strengthened Ukraine's bid for membership. And after the war is over, hopefully sooner rather than later, the main issue will be economic, sort of rebuilding Ukraine's economy. But a lot of the previously thorny political issues are actually going to probably improve. So let me start with the issue of progress before the war even started. We tend to think of Ukraine as a democratic regime, but sort of a flawed democratic regime because of issues of corruption, maybe problems with the rule of law. But what I want to argue here is that Ukraine was actually making good progress and had made under Zelensky some serious progress towards both anti-corruption, effective anti-corruption control and judicial reform. And as we know, the EU has this thorny issue of rule of law backsliding within its ranks. And in fact, Ukraine was solving some of these issues that current EU members are facing. So right before the war started, in the last couple of years, with solid assistance from the EU in close cooperation with EU partners, Ukraine had established an anti-corruption court. And that anti-corruption court is staffed with people who are vetted through a very rigorous ethics process in which both civil society groups from Ukraine participated actively and also European partners. So both Europe and civil society activists are quite confident that they had a good court in place that was ready to start working and really tackling corruption issues. It was just beginning to do that in the fall of 2021 as the Russian aggression started ramping up. But the institutional framework for it is already in place. Another success of the Zelensky administration before the war started had to do with the Supreme Judicial Council, which is an institution which all across the post-communist world has been problematic for the rule of law. Why? Because it basically has entrenched judicial elites that were working in collusion with corrupt political interests to stop anti-corruption efforts and to basically engage in politicized justice. Now, the Zelensky administration, again, with a lot of pushing from the EU, it's not that he moved very fast on this, but he was slowly moving on it in cooperation with the EU and with civil society organization, was finally making progress. In fact, shockingly, right before, literally 10 days before the invasion started, 10 formerly intransigent members of the Supreme Judicial Council resigned because they refused to go through the ethics process that was instituted by the EU and the Ethics Council of Ukraine. So this was also, had this war not started, this would have been hailed as a major judicial reform breakthrough. So in addition to judicial reform and anti-corruption efforts, the decentralization campaign or decentralization program of the Zelensky administration was already bearing fruit. And we're actually seeing this, this decentralization campaign involved sort of increasing the accountability of mayors on the ground and increasing the democratic quality of mayoral elections. This was already bearing fruit in terms of increasing levels of trust in local administration. And we see now during the war that indeed the people in those in the localities have both the political will to work as representatives of the local population and the trust of the local population, as you've seen in the south and the east of Ukraine, populations rallying around their mayors who were trying to resist the Russian invasion. So in addition to this good start in the last 2 years, the war itself is actually going to accelerate Ukraine's readiness to join the EU. Why? Because it is really showing that the Ukrainian state had more state capacity than we realized. They have really mobilized tremendously, not only to fight this war on the ground, the military, but to keep the state running. The trains are running, all state officials are working in shelters or in rural houses spread around Ukraine. They're working closely with civil society organizations to keep humanitarian relief, to keep as much of the state going as possible under direct attack by Russia. And what I think this sort of mobilization of the state and this good synchronicity between the state and civil society is going to have as an effect is that trust in state institutions is going to significantly increase obviously if this war is over sooner rather than later. And if Ukraine is victorious in it and remains an independent state. So there's a lot of ifs there, but if this is the outcome, Ukraine will come out of this more ready to meet the criteria of EU membership than it has ever been before. And a third point is that this war really demonstrated that the long-standing East-West cleavage in Ukraine has now shifted or basically has disappeared. There's no more pro-Russian Eastern and Southern Ukraine. There's been rallying around Ukrainian identity. We had seen this over the last 8 years as polls showed that even in the East and the South, voters were increasingly holding pro-Ukrainian positions. There's some political science research, for example, by my colleague Aaron Ehrlich, which shows that not only have polls shown this, but implicit association tests show that there has been a shift and voters in the south and the east of Ukraine are predominantly pro-Ukrainian right now and no longer pro-Russian. So that makes the prospects of EU membership way easier because basically politics after the war is over can be reoriented around a normal left-right cleavage rather than the previously detrimental pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian identity cleavage. So for all of these reasons, I think it is important to keep in mind that Ukraine is deserving of a pathway to EU membership, not simply on moral grounds because it is fighting so bravely for European values and for democracy, but also because it has achieved more progress than we previously noticed. And very quickly on the question of what will happen to the EU-Russia relationship. Now, obviously, there's a lot of ways in which this war can end. If it ends with Putin's removal from power, then we're in a whole different situation. But if it ends with Putin staying in power and managing to some extent to be victorious in some way and remaining in power in Russia, there really has to be a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between Europe and Russia. And it will have to shift towards containment rather than towards returning to some kind of normalcy. And Pauline already talked about, of course, the energy aspect to this, but what I want to touch on briefly is the question of whether the previously sort of Putin-leaning political actors in the EU, and we know that there was a lot of them, some of them taking directly financing from Russia and others being sort of sympathetic to the Russian position from some sort of anti-US point of view, maybe. The question is whether those people have really gotten the point that there will be no return to normal cooperation with Russia because Russia is actually seeking to undermine European democracies. The evidence so far is mixed that they have really gotten this, but what has I think become clear within the EU is that Eastern Europe is going to be pushing very strong for a containment policy because now they have a much stronger point when they said before, we are afraid of Russia, Russia is a threat. They're going to be taken at their word a lot more right now. And I'll end here.
Thank you, Maria. That was excellent. And our last speaker, over to John. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mary. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the global order and for certain regional orders that my colleagues haven't already spoken about. And the first point I want to make is you could be forgiven for thinking, if you're watching the US news media, that there's for believing that there's been this uniform global chorus of condemnation for Russia. In fact, if we look at who's participated in the sanctions regime, it really is mostly about the West. It's about Canada, the US, members of the European Union, the UK, and a handful of their closest security partners along the Pacific Rim, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. And in between, there's this vast Eurasian continent in which very few governments have decided to join the sanctions. Many have, some slowly, joined in the UN General Assembly resolutions condemning the invasion of Ukraine, but many have not even named Russia as the aggressor. And it's an indication of this possible rewiring of the international system such that countries that already are more subject to Chinese and Russian military and political influence are also likely to become more closely stitched into those metropoles economically, while the revitalization of NATO and the European Union and certain of the bilateral Pacific alliances of the US mean that there could be a configuration of Europe and the Pacific Rim and the United States arrayed against a Eurasian landmass on which China and Russia and their strengthening entente exert more influence. And so these prognostications that have existed for the past several years about a possible new Cold War, certainly Russia's invasion of Ukraine accelerates those dynamics in international politics. It's important also to think about the financial implication, the implications of the sanctions for the global financial order. While trade has already regionalized to some extent, and certainly in defense and security relations, we can see similar phenomena of regionalization. One thing that has held the so-called liberal international order together has been a relatively dominant central order for international finance, centered on the US dollar, on the SWIFT system for monitoring interbank payments located in Belgium, on the International Monetary Fund, as not the only lender of last resort, but as the one that commands the greatest attention in terms of its signals to markets, its surveillance of member economies, and so on. And so when we look at the sanctions, you can break them down into different categories. And the US and EU have thrown almost everything in the kitchen sink at Russia, with the exception of a more decisive European decision to ban gas imports and oil imports from Russia. But the other sanctions that do exist fall into several categories. One of them, pretty straightforward, is restrictions on sensitive technology going to Russia. That makes perfect sense. This is nothing new. This is a kind of sanction that has been leveled in similar conflicts in the past. It's not a quantum leap. Trade sanctions, a little more significant in the sense that Russia being no longer considered worthy by the G7 members of most favored nation status is another potential nail in the coffin of the WTO as a truly global trade organization. The third kind of sanctions, seizing the assets and the gargantuan yachts of Russian oligarchs and otherwise trying to engage in these targeted sanctioning efforts, are something that's become much more common in the last decade or so as an instrument of statecraft. But again, I wouldn't say that there's a quantum leap there. Certainly this happened a lot during the Trump administration. It was a favored dimension of US foreign policy. The fourth, and in my view, by far the most important element of these sanctions, the most novel, what used to be considered a pair of nuclear options, are in the financial sphere. One is delisting or disconnecting Russian banks from the interbank payment system. That is to say, cutting them off from the communication channels that banks use to settle their accounts every day. It's the grease, the lubrication that allows the international financial system to operate. And secondly, cutting off the Russian central bank, freezing half of Russia's $640 billion of assets and prohibiting entities outside the country, mainly Western entities, from dealing directly with Russia's central bank was also considered a nuclear financial option. These may well be warranted in view of the atrocities happening in Ukraine, but it's important to think about some of the risks. One of the obvious risks is this card can't easily be played again. Russia and its closest partners, including in Beijing, will almost certainly redouble their efforts to develop an alternative system for interbank transfers. And it might take them a while, it may take a few years, but eventually will develop a parallel system. Russia's also been cut off from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. This will be wind in the sails for Chinese or BRICS-led alternative institutions like the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and possibly the so-called contingency reserve arrangement, a sort of embryonic, a possible alternative to the IMF, also led by Beijing. And so this relatively unified international financial system that has been a linchpin for American power, but also a crucial facet of the so-called liberal order, is one that we can easily imagine being bifurcated if this conflict goes on for some time and Putin remains in power. I also think at the regional level, it's important to note a couple of fault lines that are being, if not exposed, perhaps deepened by the conflict in Ukraine. If you look at the responses of governments in the Western Hemisphere, it's a well-known pattern. Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and to a lesser extent Bolivia, lining up behind Russia, or at least acquiescing in the aggression. Other countries generally censuring the Kremlin. In the Middle East, there's a range of different opinions that have been expressed. Some governments dragged their feet to criticize Russia because they are deeply embedded in energy sector cooperation. But eventually, most Middle Eastern governments came out to criticize the Russian invasion. There are a few exceptions. Syria, unsurprisingly, lined up next to North Korea and Eritrea as countries, and Belarus as countries that blessed the invasion. Iran and Iraq both have abstained. And in other parts of the region, even where governments, such as the Lebanese government or the Yemeni government, have criticized Russia's invasion, revolutionary groups in those countries, or groups that see themselves as revolutionary, have defended Moscow. So Hezbollah and the Houthis have come out, and so have some Shia militias in Iraq on Russia's side of the equation. This is dangerous because when you compound this with the Middle Eastern equivalent of what Pauline described, the shortage of grains in a place like Lebanon, terrible economic collapse in Lebanon, millions of refugees, dysfunctional multi-confessional politics, add to that that they get 60% of their wheat from Ukraine, and there's going to be no harvest this year. You have a recipe for instability in certain pockets of the Middle East. And where that instability occurs, the positions that these various state and non-state actors are taking on the conflict suggest to us a possible deepening of the rift between predominantly Sunni-led governments in the Gulf and predominantly Shia movements through the axis of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. In South Asia, there's an interesting dynamic, and Danny already referred to this, with India standing apart from its members of the so-called Democratic Quad in Asia, and in its reluctance to sanction or even to criticize Russia for the invasion. In addition to India's long Cold War relationship with Moscow, so there are deep roots there of cooperation, India heavily dependent on Russian arms. And so when facing a more powerful China in the Himalayas, India receives about 50% of its arms shipments from Russia, and about 85% of Indian weapons systems depend in significant part on Russian hardware. So the Indian government, despite many of the Indian citizens regarding the invasion with horror, has taken out that kind of neutral position, but it's not alone. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh all abstained as well. And so South Asia looks like a place that one might have expected to be more sympathetic to Ukraine, when in fact, at least at the government level, has not been. And then last, I'll come back to Southeast Asia, which Danny touched on a bit already, and note two cleavages. One is a growing rift in the ASEAN region between the mainland and the maritime states, with the mainland states more subject to Chinese influence, pressure, economic dependency. Those governments have been generally either unwilling or very reluctant to criticize Russia's invasion. Myanmar generals defended it, perhaps unsurprisingly. Laos and Vietnam, two longstanding partners of Russia, have abstained and been mum on the issue. Cambodia and Thailand both eventually criticized it, but very gently. In maritime Southeast Asia, a different cleavage, although all five governments, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines and Indonesia, have come out against Russia's actions. In a few countries, their own populations seem to have a much more mixed set of views. And our colleague, Linda Lim, has some great analysis online yesterday about Singapore, where many citizens are getting their news from Chinese language media that are frankly spreading disinformation, but they also distrust the government and the English language media, which they see as part of a larger structural problem of these sort of English and American educated elites calling the shots and too beholden to Washington. Even in Indonesia, you see a lot of skepticism, a democratic government that has criticized this intrusion in sovereignty, a very important norm in Indonesia, but citizens often tie this together with other Western policies they disfavor regarding Palestine or other areas of the world, and simply don't trust the West and NATO, and therefore buy easily into narratives propagated by the Kremlin or by Beijing about this being the West's fault. And again, these are the kinds of pre-existing fissures that have existed across regions that seem to be exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I'll end there.
Great. Thanks, John, so much. I'd just like to remind the audience to start putting in some questions into the Q&A function, and I'll go to the Q&A in just 1 second. So I do have one. Well, let me first say, because I said to the panelists that I would do this, but would any of the panelists like to comment or raise a question to other panelists? Okay, no, okay. Okay, so I can do this. I'll take my my power as the moderator. I really enjoyed the panel, and I think it did exactly what I was hoping, which was really highlight the kind of fundamental risks and impacts of this invasion, which is a horrific invasion in and of itself to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people. But I think everyone highlighted the much broader impacts and risks. One thing I wanted to, I think it would go back to Danny, because it goes back to sort of what does China want out of this, out of the outcome. So everyone else, I think, Pauline and talking about energy, Maria talking about a new support for containment policy in Europe, John outlining the risks to the international financial and economic system that really has tied the US to China pretty closely during the more recent decades of the post-World War II period. So one possibility for what, and the outcome is that this further accelerates the decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. And as John was sort of outlining, parallel institutions that would tie Russia and China and potentially other countries in Asia together. I'm not quite sure about Latin America since it seems more divided. And that possibility is, you know, frightening for a number of different reasons, because it would mean in effect a kind of new Cold War or some kind of war. But economically, what would China's preferences be? Decoupling with the United States and the EU, going with a partnership with Russia and other developing countries? I mean, are we back to 1965 and the non-aligned movement? I mean, this is, how would you see China's preferences if this comes to pass, Danny?
Thanks, Mary. And again, you probably could give a better answer to your question than I can. But I will unabashedly join the legions of people who declare that they know what China really wants. I realize that's a terrible place to be. I don't think that China per se has an interest in decoupling as we talk about it in the West, and certainly not decoupling from incredibly valuable markets in Western Europe and in North America. Not only do they profit by exports, but they also are heavily reliant on what they import, particularly in terms of technology and capital investments, knowledge, etc. So there's nothing really appealing about slamming a door shut, let alone making Russia your principal economic partner. I don't think Xi Jinping really wants to handcuff himself to Russia at the expense of being able to do business and get what he wants from the developing world. And on top of that, I think by and large, Russia has been reasonably comfortable operating in the longstanding Western US-led structures that John referred to, with the caveat that what it has tried to do is to build in exemptions for itself, alibis and safe spaces that allow Beijing to avoid the consequences or the limits that the existing post-war global system seeks to impose. So what this all boils down to is what has been coined in China as dual circulation. In other words, a selectively permeable membrane controlled by the Chinese Communist Party that lets the good air in and the bad air out, that chooses what China will admit from the rest of the world, whether it is in the form of products or people or data or information, and similarly what China will export, including data, information, etc. I think that the simple answer is that they want to have it both ways. Now, I totally agree with the analysis by John and others that the recent crisis in the Ukraine is accelerating the trend towards the separation of blocs and forcing the Chinese in their own defense to develop alternative structures, the obvious one being an alternative to SWIFT, to extricate themselves from the tyranny of the dollar, etc. The use of these so-called nuclear options in finance create their own antibodies that mean that they will gradually be faced with a sanctions-resistant threat from autocracies. That I wouldn't. I think that to think in terms of decoupling as a willful Chinese objective is a mistake.
Thanks. Okay, so thanks, Danny. Let me go to the Q&A. So this first question from Annie, what kind of news streams are being shown in the stands? Do they know why their economies are suddenly crashing? So getting to the question of fake news or information flows in Central Asia.
Sure. So this is not Central Asia's first rodeo when it comes to knowing that when Russia's economy is in free fall, they will feel the effects. It just hasn't been quite this bad. After the sanctions in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, I guess you might say, and annexed Ukrainian territory, they felt the impact of the sanctions. So there's some knowledge, there's some history there, some understanding that's pretty broad across society. The state also, the governments of these countries have no interest in shielding Russia from the blame for this, for the economic woes that they're feeling. And there are countries in the region, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, that still have, believe it or not, fairly independent media. And what you're seeing in the independent media is you're seeing use of the terms that the state media won't use. So the state media won't use the terms war, aggression, invasion, but the independent media is using them. And even more importantly, the local language, so the Kazakh language and the Kyrgyz language media are using these terms. They're also using terms like, we could be next, right? The Russian aggression could be aimed at us. Kazakhstan had a large protest. I think I mentioned it in my remarks. I know this isn't about the media, but the media did pick up the protest. And one of the popular signs of the protest was yesterday Georgia, today Ukraine, tomorrow Kazakhstan. So they see the connection, not just economically, they see the connection politically. And there's a lot of, like I said, visible popular opposition to this war.
Great, thanks. I'm going to skip around a little bit. So if people don't see their question answered right away, don't worry, I'll try to get to all of them. This question from Stuart, and this maybe is open to anyone, I guess. Why do we have to frame the discussion in terms of Russia and authoritarian regimes, in quotes, and the US-led liberal order? It's understandable why so many parts of the world don't trust the recently hypocritical quality of democracy, in quotes, of the West, considering the failures in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. So it seems we need something different than our narrative versus their narrative. How about a Treaty of Westphalia approach where the interests of all are considered? Who would like to take that? Maria, go ahead.
I mean, I will take this question in part because I'm not going to talk about a Treaty of Westphalia or the ways in which the West got some parts wrong. But what I want to answer here is sort of why the West is not to blame for this crisis right now, for why Russia is invading Ukraine. I mean, the key Russian narrative here is that Russia has been humiliated at the end of the Cold War. But in reality, the West did not humiliate Russia. There were no reparations paid to Eastern Europe for 40 years of oppression by the Soviet Union. There was no meaningful transitional justice in Russia to deal with the communist past. What we had in the 30 years between the end of the Cold War and this invasion is Europe slowly, Eastern Europe, slowly begging one by one to be accepted by the West because they were threatened by Russia and they saw that Russia is moving again into an authoritarian direction. And they were really desperate to join the West. The West did not lure them there. The West, in fact, very slowly, through a lot of conditionality, acquiesced to accepting those countries. So it really is not possible, this narrative that NATO expansion somehow antagonized Russia has it all backwards. Basically, the story is the opposite. Had Eastern Europe not managed, or parts of it not managed to become part of NATO, today we would be talking not just about the invasion of Ukraine, but the really serious and realistic danger of a new Yalta that would reintroduce oppression to a bigger part of of Eastern Europe.
Thanks. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add to Stuart's important question. I think that the liberal international order has a few features that are genuinely liberal. One of them is that the core group of countries that have sort of set up and maintained that order are, at least in comparative terms, relatively liberal in their domestic politics. There is genuinely more freedom in Western Europe than there is in Russia. Another is that the order is liberal in the sense that, although hardly free from blemishes, high agricultural subsidies in rich countries, for example, it still has been a comparatively open order, an accessible one for economically for countries around the world. So in economic and financial terms, it has been a relatively liberal order rather than the kind of balkanized order that we're all imagining could come about. But then there's this third face of the liberal international order, which your question refers to, and that is, how do people largely in the global South experience this order? And in many parts of the global South, they experience this through transnational corporations having close ties to repressive or out-of-touch domestic elites, occasional heavy-handed interventions by Western powers, whether through NATO or through bilateral means, that leave a lot of pottery broken and unfixed. And so part of the story of what I was describing as this sort of quick run through international responses and sometimes the divergence between publics and their governments on the invasion of Ukraine is this very powerful sense that the liberal international order hasn't been too liberal to us. And so if you look at the sort of media treatment of the Ukraine invasion in Africa, for example, there has generally been widespread condemnation of what Russia's doing, but also usually in the same paragraph, a reminder that Russia's hardly the first, that the US government or others have also exerted their will through military means, often with negative consequences. Certainly that's a powerful narrative in the Middle East and other regions as well. So I take your point that, especially when talking about this outside of a European context, there's going to be much more skepticism of the notion that this is really sort of a good guy, bad guy, liberal versus authoritarian conflict. There's more of a likelihood that this is going to be seen as a kind of a neo-Westphalian power conflict.
Great, thank you. I think, unfortunately for Danny, maybe another question about what China wants. Do you believe that if China participates in this war supporting Russia, what is the possibility of having another world war if China enters the war supporting Russia? From Gabriel.
Yeah, I find it very hard to begin a scenario from the premise that China would participate in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it would participate in a war. That certainly, I mean, it's certainly true that Xi Jinping has surprised American policymakers, myself included, on the downside by having more risk tolerance than his predecessors. But war is not what China is all about. China is all about winning without fighting. And in a few cases, the Korean War being an exception, where China has used military force in the last 40 plus years, it's been highly limited, and it's more about teaching a lesson than it is about taking territory or destroying armies. So I think that's an improbable scenario. Now, it is entirely imaginable that since I believe that for the Chinese Communist Party, Putin being deposed, Putin losing power in Russia would be a very unfavorable outcome, very risky by way of analogy to their own political system, that the Chinese would consider offering certain kinds of assistance if they felt that that really might spell the difference between what they perceive as a disastrous outcome and a tolerable outcome. But in all cases, they would seek to extend assistance in ways that didn't bring them into direct confrontation with the United States. unless the chest bumping expanded beyond what the Russians are doing and materialized in the form of new and highly provocative US supporter actions for Taiwan. So the short answer is I just don't see the Chinese calculating that what Putin is trying to do is worth shedding Chinese blood for, although they're perfectly content to, as I said, have Russia disrupt the West, distract the West. And I think the Chinese had counted on and will still be hoping for Putin's actions in Ukraine to surface some divisions between the Europeans and Washington.
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that I think are somewhat related. So in regards to energy, would you say that it's possible that this conflict will shift the reliance on oil to other sources, or will it only push for further use of it? Is it possible that countries reliant on Russia's resources will try to look for other suppliers? I guess that's for Pauline. Sounds like it's for Pauline.
Do you want to give us a few and because we only have a few minutes left, or do you want me to answer that?
So I do have another one that seems to be also directed towards your area that you covered.
Okay.
And let me just, sorry, I have to scroll through and, okay, so there's three. You can choose. If Putin is deposed, what should we expect to replace him? Or who, I suppose. Pauline alluded to some interesting unambiguous signs of support within Kazakhstan, Kurdistan, and other Central Asian countries for Ukraine. And I would love to hear more about that support and what that looks like.
Okay, so I think I think I've already answered the third one, and just in my remarks earlier, just that the signs of support are coming both from the Kazakh language media, the independent media, but also the large public demonstration that happened in the financial capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty, where people were carrying these very bold signs. There's also been some signs, though, in some of the other more repressive republics, like, independent states. That was my old Soviet cap, like Uzbekistan. There's been some small demonstrations and people painting, murals and things like this in support of Ukraine. So, in terms of what will replace Putin, I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that question. I think that's one of the many reasons why a coup or any kind of removal of Putin is very unlikely. I mean, maybe Maria has a more concrete answer to that, but I don't think there's by design, these kinds of autocratic regimes don't want to have a viable successor that's lined up. So there isn't really someone who's viable that's waiting to kind of step in. It might very well be total chaos. The only kind of democratic leader, potential leader, is still in prison, Navalny, and I'm not sure really how much popular support he has to launch some kind of democratic revolution. That would have to be seen. I think it's highly speculative what or who would replace Putin. In terms of diversification away from Russian energy, I mean, there's two different but related: Russian energy and then energy or fossil fuels. I think there's definitely likelihood, especially with Europe. There's definitely will. There's more will now than I think there ever has been. There's movement, not just political, but actual financial, dedication and investment, or the at least call for investment on the part of European leaders. I think the United States should also support and invest the diversification away from Russian oil. But in terms of fossil fuels itself, I mean, that's what has to happen globally, and only the richer countries can really invest in the cleaner technologies that we need to invest in. But that's what the richer countries should do, and they should help do them for poorer countries. It'll take a long time, but in the short term, we can at least diversify away from Russia as a primary energy source, even if not oil.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let me couple questions for Maria, and then 2 or 3 questions that either John or Danny could answer, or might want to answer. This is from Judith. Excellent presentations. My question is for Professor Popova. Is there any evidence that Ukraine's accelerated progress toward meeting the criteria for EU admission contributed to Putin's decision to invade? Perhaps the actual existential threat to the Putin regime is not Ukrainian membership in NATO, but a post-Soviet democracy in the a Russian term, which maybe means the Soviet Union. I think that it means the Soviet Union because I don't actually read Russian. Second, but I can guess, I kind of see it. Are Russians insecure because of past brutalizations of their neighbors and therefore have a need to maintain domination of neighboring territories? So Maria, do you want to try one or both of those questions?
So the first question is a really good one, and I do agree that much more so than NATO, the threat to Putin has been a highly competitive, politically competitive Ukraine. And it's particularly threatening because he sees Ukraine as this brotherly nation, which is very similar to Russia, and as a consequence can be a potential example for Russians who may start thinking, well, why don't we have that competitive regime? And indeed, there is some sort of speculative evidence that initially Putin, because Zelensky was elected on a platform that promised some sort of rapprochement and some sort of compromise with Russia. Maybe Putin expected that what would be possible would be some sort of capitulation of Ukraine to Russian demands through Zelensky. But in fact, when as a result of the fact that he was a democratically elected leader, so he has to respond to where society is on things, Zelensky very quickly realized that he couldn't actually pursue compromise with Russia because this was really totally unacceptable for the Ukrainian public. And very soon, Russia started calling Zelensky even worse than his predecessor and so awful. So there is some evidence that that indeed Russia was very threatened by the progress that that Ukraine was making towards the EU, basically, going in a European direction. Now, can you remind me the second question?
The second question was, are Russians insecure because of past brutalizations of their neighbors and therefore have a need to maintain domination of neighboring territories?
So basically the key there is that Russia has really not gone through a process of coming to terms with its colonial past and coming to terms with the fact that it controlled these territories as an empire and attacked neighbors regularly. There hasn't been a reckoning sort of with this in Russia. In fact, this is very much, this invasion is very much sort of spurred by a very colonial narrative that Ukraine is not really a separate nation because it was part of the Russian Empire. Ukrainians were part of the Russian Empire. So it cannot possibly be a legitimate separate nation. And in fact, even some of the anti-war protesters in Russia are using this brotherly nation sort of as a, the small sibling kind of colonial attitude, which really does not go well with Ukrainians right now who are very proud of their independent statehood. So it is very much motivated by this neo-colonial and agenda.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to read off 4 questions that are mostly about kind of other global responses or possible measures for, I think, John and Danny before we close at 5:30. From Annie, Turkey seems to be straddling the fence, not condemning Russia, but supplying Ukraine with drones and closing the Bosphorus to Russian military traffic. Is that not a recipe for disaster? From Carla, besides Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, what has the overall response from Latin America been to this conflict, mainly economically? And then Jordan, what leverage can the United States realistically wield against China to dissuade it from bailing Russia out from Western sanctions? And lastly, and a similar question, I think, to Jordan's from Sarah, what are potential successful responsible power campaign actions that both the United States and China are expected to undertake over the course of this conflict? And what are the most important points of convergence and divergence along these paths? So great questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to any other questions. I think we're going to run out of time, but John or Danny, go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I can say a few things about the first 2. It was striking when Turkey declared that it was going to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. For those audience members who aren't as familiar with the geography, Russia needs to be able to get through the Black Sea and through these narrow waterways that cross the city of Istanbul in Turkey to get into the Eastern Mediterranean. And so it really is a strategic choke point for the Russian Navy not to be able to get from this huge naval base they occupy in Crimea since the 2014 intervention there, to be able to operate in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey's decision was striking. Turkey has, as the question posits, tried to straddle the fence a little bit. It has had in recent years a more positive relationship with Russia. It's gotten into the crosshairs of its NATO treaty allies by procuring weapon systems from Russia as an apparent effort to hedge or diversify away from NATO and its European and American partners. Would it be disastrous if Russia tried to essentially break through those waterways? It could be, if Turkey actually was determined to try to stop that from happening. My guess is that the Turkish government would back down in that kind of a scenario and leave deterrence to the United States fleet in the Mediterranean and to the sort of broader NATO coalition and US nuclear umbrella. I don't think that the Turks would be willing to initiate a war with Russia over passage through the Dardanelles. If they were to do that, remember, the first shell that lands on Turkey's soil is an attack on a NATO territory, which activates Article 5 of NATO and therefore brings the United States immediately into the war. President Biden couldn't have been clearer about that principle. What is, I think, more likely, I don't think either Russia or Turkey wants to confront that scenario. What I think is more likely is that if Turkey's opposition to Russia's operations in Ukraine continue, that Russia will take other measures that make life difficult for the Turks, most likely in the east rather than the west of the country, in places like Nagorno-Karabakh, where there are disputed regions where Turkey and Russia have been involved. And I think that could be one of a number of pressure points that Russia could activate that would be within its sort of modus operandi of gray zone or hybrid operations that don't necessarily constitute a direct attack on NATO, but that could complicate Turkey's business. As far as Latin America, I don't have a great panoramic sense of how the economic responses have been, but I did notice another question in the chat asked about Venezuela specifically, whether Maduro's closeness with Russia how that would play out in this scenario. My guess is that Maduro would be more than happy to get the United States to provide some form of legitimation and easing of sanctions in exchange for releasing some oil into Western Hemisphere markets. And so I would expect that the Venezuelan regime will be willing to talk and will not try to shun the United States' efforts to get Venezuela to open the spigot.
Mary, I'll take the last 2 questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So on leverage, my experience in government as a diplomat is that there are essentially two forms of leverage. One is offering another country what that country wants. The other is proposing to do something that that country doesn't want you to do. So for the first kind of leverage to work, kind of positive sum leverage, either requires that there is a foundation of a certain amount of trust between the two countries so that they will believe that the other is going to follow through on whatever this formal and informal agreement is, or that you're organizing it kind of the way that drug dealers organize a big buy, at gunpoint with a lot of suspicion. And that would require sort of a barter agreement of something that the Chinese really want for the kind of cooperation that the United States might be looking for with regard to Russia. And I think we all know that's not going to happen because the self-declared core interests of China are anathema to US values. They're exactly the sorts of things like the treatment of religious minorities in Xinjiang, or threats to Taiwan, or heavy-handed extra-legal tactics in the South China Sea that the United States is deeply committed to oppose. So it's not easy to see that there's certainly not easy to see any positive leverage. And that leaves the negative form. In other words, threatening consequences to China for their behavior, something that the US has been actively embarked on, certainly throughout the Trump administration in the first year plus of the Biden administration. That also does not always work, and of course carries very significant downsides, but that is the form of leverage that the administration is clearly reaching for. As far as a responsible power campaign by Beijing and Washington, I think we can see those campaigns are clearly well underway today. All you have to do is look at the spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, or the op-ed that was published this morning in the Washington Post by the Chinese ambassador to the United States, and you can see China's description of itself as this sort of benevolent and responsible power. And conversely, all the statements coming out of Washington, the tweets from the Secretary of State and so on, lean in the same direction. So what we're seeing really is not a convergence, but a battle of narrative power when it comes to casting the government in question as the responsible power, and either directly or implicitly casting the other government as irresponsible and part of the problem. I think that there are points of overlap in terms of some of the words that are being invoked about peaceful resolution, negotiations, and sovereignty and territorial integrity. Although in practice, the US and China are defining these on the ground in very different ways. I could imagine that when it comes to reconstruction of the Ukraine and to some forms of humanitarian assistance, you could see some overlap, some coordination. But frankly, if the US and China couldn't fundamentally coordinate on a horrific virus that killed 2 million people on Earth, I think the prospects for responsible power cooperation are slender.
Thanks, Danny. We are out of time. We're a minute over. So I just want to thank all the panelists. It was really excellent. It did exactly what I was hoping. We ended on a pessimistic note, but this is a pessimistic subject. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And This will be up on our YouTube page in a few days. So thank you again all so much. Good night.